The webinar is now broadcasting to all attendees. So my screen tells me. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen of Norfolk, of the UK, of the whole wide world. And welcome to the second of our Norfolk Wildlife Trust Cley Calling events of 2020. Now, in the good old days, we used to operate these as events. We used to meet as human beings, and we're now occupying the dark underbelly of the internet in order to reach you wherever you are in the world, which does, as we were just discussing between Tim and our producer, David, allow us much, much greater reach. And so we are delighted to welcome people from all over the world. Just for your information, this is the second in a series of events called Cley Calling, and you can find information about all of the upcoming events through the rest of the year at cleycalling.com. That's Cley Calling, all one word, .com. And in fact, the next event is with the marvelous conservationist, reintroducer, rewilder, Roy Dennis, and that will be taking place in 2 weeks' time today. This is a free event. All of our Cley Calling events this year are free. However, should you be so bowled away by the genius of Tim Dee's Greenery, which is our subject for this evening, and wish to make a donation to Norfolk Wildlife Trust, we shall be delighted to receive it. And you can find the link to the opportunity to make a donation both in the chat as part of this Zoom Live event. And also you can receive that information in the emails with which we shall be bombarding you. No, there will be one follow-up email which will have that link. It will also have a link to your opportunity to buy this marvelous book, which is Tim Dee's Greenery, Journeys in Springtime, which is the subject of our evening. Now, you can find that link in the chat of this Zoom conversation, and you can also find that link in the email that you'll receive to thank you for taking part in our event. That's available from wildsounds.com, who are our partners in crime. They stock all of the books to our visitor centres and are fantastic supporters of conservation the world over. And in this case, by purchasing Tim's book, you will not only have a most marvellous book at your disposal, but you will also make a 10% donation to Norfolk Wildlife Trust. And as I say, the link is in the chat and will be in an email that you'll receive as well. If you have questions to Tim this evening, then please drop them as soon as you can into the question and answer box. What will happen is that I will curate the questions. Sadly, we probably won't be able to answer all of the questions because time is relatively tight. However, I will select a number of questions. Some of them, for the sake of expediency, I will read to Tim. And some of them I will enable so that we can bring you in live. Now, all of this depends on David Fieldhouse, who is our education officer based at Cley, who arranges all of our events at Cley and indeed further afield and nowadays online. So David will enable some of you to come online and you can ask your questions of Tim directly. Now, we are speaking to you from 2 places this evening, but David is in a 3rd place. David's in Norwich. I'm in North Norfolk, where it's a bit squally and thundery outside, so if I lose my internet, I apologise. Tim, whom I will finally bring into the conversation in a moment, is in South Africa, and just in conversation a moment ago, occasionally we've had the odd glitch on the line between us, so do bear with us. If anything goes wrong, we will come back online, and you'll be able to come back online using the same link. If Tim drops out for a moment, I might repeat the question if people haven't heard, but bear with us. I promise it will be a fascinating evening. This really is a joy. I'm not just saying this. This is a joy of a book to read, and I, for one, am very, very excited for the chance to speak about it. So, no further ado, on to you. Welcome, Tim Dee from Scarborough, South Africa. How are you?
Thank you, Nick. I'm very well. It's the middle of the winter here. Well, the beginning of spring, really. So, it's been dark for a couple of hours. I did have a quick walk on the beach earlier. We had a big storm yesterday coming through, lots of lovely new kelp all over the place. I managed to get the head off a dead shy albatross a week or so ago, so I'm nurturing that in the back garden. We're looking forwards to the swallows, the first swallows from Europe, probably in a month or so, not quite yet. Swifts may be earlier, but most of the swifts, it seems, in Cape Town are probably these interesting Pekinensis, are they called, the Chinese swifts, which have been tracked following all the way down through Asia and then across East Africa. So we might see some swifts, but not yet, and swallows shortly. There's some whimbrel here, weirdly, already that haven't, maybe they never went north. I think that's probably the case. But so I sort of semi in touch with Europe, and when there were swallows here, I was massively in touch. I felt it was really it was central, and indeed it becomes part of the genesis of my book. Was working out what the swallows in Cape Town were doing, and how I felt confused by seeing my swallows in my wife's country.
How fascinating. Now, I suspect that among the assembled company, many will be from the UK, and you've probably put a lot of hackles up by mentioning swallows and swifts, because the swifts are hemorrhaging from the UK day by day, and within a few days there will be none left. And the swallows are already gathering in ominous flocks. And so while we wish you joy of our swallows and our swifts, we are suffering from their disappearance ourselves. Now, Tim, your book, Greenery, Journeys in Springtime. I've had a bit of a headache getting my questioning prepared for this book, because in one way it's a very straightforward book. It is the narrative of a bird's movement up through Africa and up through Europe, and eventually ending up at the top of a mountain in the north of Norway. And you take us geographically, step by step, from the Cape of Good Hope through Chad, Ethiopia, Gibraltar, up to Heligoland, Ham Wall in the south of England, through Slovakia and Shetland, Estonia, Iceland, Denmark, and finally as far north as Norway. Now, in that sense, it's a very straightforward book. And it's also a hellish, complex book, full of bewildering reference and massive in its scope in terms of human experience and in terms of human emotion. And it's densely woven and springs between unexpected references, in a sense. So I wanted to ask first about your reference. It is a book laden with erudite reference to many, many authors, and among them D.H. Lawrence, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, both of the Wordsworths, Emily Dickinson, Seamus Heaney, who all feature quite large. I wanted to ask about the process of identifying how the quotations, how the stories fit into place. Do you start with the quotations and think, I'd like to include that? Or do you write the book about the birds and then think, oh, that would be handy? How does it work in that sense?
Well, first of all, I think I should say sorry.
Well, yes, you should. You should.
Sorry for this dense and complicated book. And then, I mean, in terms of trying to justify the inclusion of those things, to answer your question, I think my problem, my issue, my shtick, if you like, has always been trying to live with this wonderful dual economy that I grew up with, which was, if you like, birds and words. I mean, I became a reader of poems about birds at the same time as I became an identifier of tree pipits, if you like. And I loved the pure facticity of wildlife. I love putting names to birds and seeing lots of different birds. But I also loved at the same time, and I never felt there was any hostility in these two camps, I also loved the imaginative use to which the tree pipit or any other pipit had been put. I think, by the way, it's very important that we know and how much bigger our lives are if we know that there are tree pipits and rock pipits and meadow pipits and olive back pipits, if you like, all pipits, better than just a little brown job. And I was particularly drawn towards literature that wasn't bird literature, if you like, but which knew that there were many different sorts of pipits, or literature that had paid close attention, as extraordinarily a lot of poetry does seem to do. It's amazing how many good bird watchers there are who become good poets. And poetry, and especially perhaps out of the kind of artistic writings in life has paid more attention to bird life than other literary forms, perhaps. And I think that kind of attention that makes a good writer, a good poet, a good imaginative writer, attention to detail, which is what often is at the kernel or hub of a nub of a poem, is a very similar act of looking at the world that might be what a birdwatcher does, or what a naturalist is switched on by, a kind of close investigation of the local and the specific being important. And so I always wanted, to begin with, I was neurotic and had my bird books on one shelf and my poetry books on another shelf. And then I read things like Ted Hughes's Crow as a kid, and an early encounter with John Buxton's marvelous book on the redstart in the New Naturalist series, which is a book written by, which I quote from Greenery, and I've written about before, a book written by a poet who became a scientist by accident when he was a prisoner of the Germans in the Second World War and studied redstarts coming through the fence of his prison camp. And he wrote an amazingly poetic book of fact about a monograph of the redstart. So I was always aware of those books growing up, and I often had difficult conversations. A lot of my birdwatching friends were definitely not interested in Ted Hughes or any other bird poetry, and they wanted just the field guide version of the birds, effectively, to be drilled into their heads. And then a lot of my friends, when I became a student of literature, had no interest in the outside world, really. They thought literature was a hermetic pursuit to do with the inside of people's heads, rather than actually a report upon what was happening outside. So I've long spent a lot of my time jumping between those two schools, if you like, and I always wanted. I actually feel that probably something seen by a poet and put into words by a poet is as good as anything written by as a scientist, in terms of getting towards a deeper truth of what a bird means to us. Maybe not what a bird means to itself. And I argue with my wife about this. But so I've always wanted this mix, this dual economy, as I said. And I've always thought better to find a poetical reference to a bird, say, than the Handbook of the Birds of the World, which is around me here. So I prefer to go to more imaginative sources to back up my way of seeing, than to the facts. I love the facts, and there are lots of facts in my book as well. And my wife is a scientist and vets my books like mad, and crosses out all sorts of things where she thinks I go too far. But I've wanted to undermine both the science, if you like, with the poetry, but also undermine the poetry with science. And so it's that mixture.
You do it magnificently. And you have also, I'm feeling rather smug, actually, because I've made a lot of notes on your book, and I've chosen a lot of quotations and come up with a lot of questions. And you've just touched on a tremendous amount of the stuff that I'd identified as being particularly interesting in your book. And I'd just like to come back to you with a quote. I'm afraid I shall do this many times this evening, but come back to you with a quotation from your own book, because you just mentioned one of the things that struck me as really interesting, which was this idea of the human interacting with the wildlife and changing the nature of what's happening. And you're in a hide in Romania watching bears, and you say, of course, I remade the bear as it came into my head. I cannot really report on what I saw, but only on what I made of what I saw. Everything is italicized by our looking, which is a magnificent way of putting it. But I'm going to jump back to where I was, to quote you again, but actually from a different source, from I think your first book, The Running Sky, which I also loved. As a teenager, I was hardcore and obsessed, but I'm not a professional bird man now. I'm not very sharp in the field. I misidentify birds and get bored and eat my packed lunch at 10:30 in the morning. Now, I actually disagree with that. I think you're a very, very sharp bird man, but I love that. That's humour worthy of Simon Barnes, who is also a very self-mocking bird watcher, but also a very skilled and wonderful bird watcher and writer about birds. But I wanted to ask you, because you're having said that about yourself, I did suspect what you've just touched on, that Claire, your wife, was probably your source of main reference for the bird science, and of course her network of collaborators around the world. Is that how the the science, of which there is much and it's wonderful and informative. Is that how it comes about?
Yeah, in some ways, if I hadn't met her, I don't think this book would exist in the ways that it does. But I mean, of course, you can also find your way to other experts and scientists without a wife. I'm not sure I would know how to do that now, but other people probably could. I mean, I think to be kinder to myself, I do think I have always loved something about the language of natural history writing, the way in which the field note and the observation taken down in the field that becomes a description of a species. You know, there's wonderful miniature essays in British Birds magazine that describe the first sighting of the sorrel rail or whatever it was. Those are fantastic to me, and they're sorts of forms of poetry in a strange way. The people who write them would be horrified to think that they were being accused of writing poetry. But I do think that the language we use to describe the birds, even the scientific language, is in itself a construct. Obviously, it's not. There's a wonderful line that Aldo Leopold, the great American conservation writer, writes about how we mustn't confuse basically nature's writing with nature writing. The way that a greater yellowlegs, he describes, a greater yellowlegs walks a poem that no dint of my cerebration, or something like that is his phrase, could produce. You know, so the idea that this bird is making its own calligraphy in the way that it moves across a salt marsh is wonderful, and it's behoves us to remember that scientific writing doesn't actually take us any closer, truly, to the objects of study than a poem does. Perhaps maybe I'm repeating myself here, but so I know she helps me. And some of the work I cite in there is actually work done by colleagues of hers, but and she's wonderful. She's got a institutional access to Nature and Science and other journals, and so she sends me a daily kind of like a muesli, a sort of hardcore muesli diet of tough, gritty papers that I can't really understand. If I can get through the summary, the abstract, I'm really happy. But then I go back to her and say, what does this really mean? But yeah, so it's great, and I also like the way that scientific discovery can release all sorts of imaginative ideas. I mean, one of the things I get very excited in this book is working out and talking about the way birds molt on migration, and that actually they grow. We now know, because of stable isotopes being secreted into feathers. You can identify almost to a square meter of ground where a bird has grown up and acquired its feathers, because the stable isotope is written into the plumage, and it carries that writing in the plumage for as long as it has that set of feathers. So we now know much more about molt on wintering grounds for birds, and yet that changes the whole idea to me of where a bird is made. And if we begin to think about, we were talking about our swallows or your swallows and your swifts that you're holding on to, desperately not wanting them to go. Actually, those swallows and swifts grew their feathers down where I am, if you don't mind. So they're mine more than yours. Or not the young ones, of course. The young ones are still yours because they got their feathers out of flies in North Norfolk. Anyway, I like to release those ideas into the imagination as much as into the world of fact, if you like.
I'm tempted at this point to walk the 30 yards behind me and pick some baby swallows out of the nest in the back passage to my garden, just to show you they are indeed my swallows. How very dare you. Now, you've touched on another thing there, the idea of poetry. Now, in this case, you were writing a poem in stable isotopes in the bird's plumage as it migrates around the world, puts a girdle around the world, to coin a phrase. But poetry, words, it's quite obvious that you love words, and you love words in a very playful, at times extremely humorous way, a very, very poetic way. Now, you mentioned it a couple of times, and before we came on air and we were talking, you mentioned your friendship with Mark Cocker, but in the book he's mentioned 2 or 3 times. Now, Mark is a glorious, magnificent recorder of our relationship with birds and with countryside and with nature and landscape. And two of his books in particular, Birds and People and Our Place, they are soaring books of the great work and erudition and knowledge. But I would say that he doesn't play with words in the same way. He doesn't have the same irreverent light-footedness with words that you have, and it's one of the characteristics. So I'm just going to read a few things that struck me as being particularly lovely. We watched the crocodiles, or rather we slid into some stretched minutes of crocodile time, which for them is mostly a waiting in the long now of their evolution. And the same trip to Chad, I just thought this was glorious. His slippers were lark-like. What a beautiful, beautiful image. And I could go on and on and on. At one moment of humour, this had me absolutely, genuinely laughing out loud. In a book of natural history, standing above a beach, I'm going to giggle. I had never seen real bosoms in the wild before. A truly great line. And then, talking of Tolland Man, there's a lovely passage about Tolland Man. He looks like a sleeping whippet as painted by Lucien Freud. What I'm trying to highlight is the fact that you play with imagery and with words, and you clearly have a great joy in words themselves and their power. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I do, and I think that's important, and I think that's. I mean, I'm not a very good bird watcher, and I'm not a very good. I'm not a poet, if you like, either. So, but what I've got is this working through with the words, and I take those words seriously, and I field test them all the time. I think one of the great pleasures of writing about, I mean, it's so much easier writing about things that can't speak back to you and tell you that actually that is a misrepresentation of who I am, what I am. So it's easier. When the birds get rights, like people have got these days, it will become nature writing will be finished. And of course, the cultural appropriation of birds, remains to be discussed. Maybe birds don't want to be written about in that way. Well, we'll see. Anyway, but I think for me, it's important to try to take. I mean, I do my minting in my head on my words, but I try to road test everything I write and put it back on the object or the creature itself and see whether it still works and can be permitted. Claire, if I can use a rude word, is my first reader, and she is known for putting my wife Claire the letter W in the margin of my manuscripts, W for wank. When she thinks I've gone too far. So some of those phrases have been seen by her, vetted by her, and luckily she's passed them. But there's plenty more that she's banned. So I think it's, what have I got? That I mean, I would wish to dispute with you. I think Mark's a beautiful writer, actually. And he drills down, that's one of his own phrases, to drill down into his subject. And I think he also tests furiously, the writing, and nothing florid, no persiflage, no exaggeration. Everything seems to fit. And if you spin it back round and say, he describes a redstart in this way, I describe a redstart in that way. I hope that both of our descriptions of redstarts are not too much, and that somehow that the bird would understand and would recognize itself in the description if it was that was possible. But that's the fun of it. I mean, that's where that's where I think there is something truly to be said for this form of writing. I mean, that is neither, to go back to our original theme, neither scientific writing nor poetry, if you like. And I think in that middle ground is an opportunity to be playful, but also passionate, intense in our, because I think our own responses to those creatures can be as highly charged as some of the language I hope that I'm using. And I'm not. I would hate. I mean, if people do think I'm a pretentious wanker, that's fine.
I think that's largely only your wife, isn't it, by the sounds of things?
No, let me assure you, I haven't got the file of letters here, but I mean they're in Bristol. But yeah, no. So that's you know that's what I can do. That's what I do.
Well,
and I would hope I'm harder on myself than anyone else could be. I mean that's the crucial thing in the writing process is to kill your darlings, as someone has said. You know, is to not be in love too much with your words. I mean, there's a pretty intense chapter or part of a chapter in this book about the woodcock, which really does push it out a bit. And I don't think I've ever written anything quite as wankish to publication as that. And we'll see. I mean, sometimes I wince in the morning to think when I pull back the covers and look at what I am and what I've done, and other times I'm happy to get up.
Well, I believe you do it with great, great beauty. And as I said, I merely point out a difference between you and Mark. Mark is a magnificent writer, and his books are magnificent, but there's much more seriousness about the way he writes words.
He's also, he comes from Buxton in Derbyshire. and his father ran a freezer store where selling, you know, kind of Iceland, equivalent of Iceland, a local version of Iceland. And I come from the soft south, and my dad was a businessman. You know.
So you're allowed to be more florid with words. Well, I should read you a couple more that are things that really struck me as extremely beautiful. This is in Langano in Ethiopia, a place I've been myself many times and love. We listened. Was the nightjar's nocturne going into the head of the willow warbler? Are there willow warblers in Europe that remember the rocks at Langano and how they purr after the sun goes? That's absolutely beautiful. You're almost there making a reference to Isak Dinesen, Karen Blixen in Shadows on the Grass. Are you aware of that?
No, but I have read that, I think, a long 100 years ago. But,
glorious. She too, a mistress of words. And then out on the open water, beyond the green spears of new reeds, was a pair of black-necked grebes, birds made of soot and gold. You are a master of poetic description, which leads me on really to my next question. The other day, I was interviewing Ian Newton, whom you may know, perhaps through Claire, perhaps, yeah, the most significant contributor to the popular understanding of science about birds of a generation, the author of 5 new naturalists. And I was interviewing him for Bird Fair coming up about his new book, Uplands and Birds. And we had a wonderful conversation about all of the facts around uplands and populations of birds and the potential of rewilding and the threats facing various birds. And slightly devil's advocate, I asked him at the end whether he had a relationship with poetry around birds and art of birds. And he said exactly what I suspected he would do. He slightly tugged his chin and said, not really, it's not of much interest to me. He said, I want the facts. I want to know what's going on. And he said, I do admire those who can write poetry about birds. I just don't, it's not for me, he said. And I feel, and you've touched on this before this evening, I feel you occupy, or you bring us to almost a mythological space between history and poetry and human experience and birds, and their symbols as part of human experience, which I think is extremely beautiful. And there's a moment in Heligoland, for example, it's just glorious, where the gannets are Scythians, and you have the Scythians riding across Central Asia, and the gannets riding across the waves, supreme in their elements, and yet, to use a word you use quite a lot in the book, dwelling in shit at home. And there are plenty more examples of this. And I feel, you feel, that by not interpreting our experience of the natural world, we actually lose our humanity. So to go back to the bears, you say the night's bearlessness, so this is the first time when you don't see bears, the night's bearlessness made this happen. The absence of a bear helped me see in the dark. If I had seen a bear, I would have seen nothing else. Without the bear, I could see everything. And that takes us to what I would describe as this mythological space, where we're understanding profound things by virtue of our experience of nature.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that's a lovely and warm and smart interpretation. I mean, it's also, I'm also acutely aware that I'm a bird watcher who spent a lot of his bird watching life missing birds and not seeing things, and having time to think about the not seeing of things. And when I was a teenage twitcher, that was awful. The drive back from Norfolk to Bristol when you dipped was a catastrophic, dreary thing, relieved only by the fish and chip shop in Bedford, and that was pretty cold and waxy. So the idea of that, yeah, I mean, I want to think about the way we commodify nature, the way we look at it, the way we attempt to take possession of it, the way we refashion it in our minds, we take it into ourselves and give it back out as something other than what it is. I don't think that is a form of, I mean, that is a form of appropriation. It's a sort of speciesist attitude, but it seems to be fundamental to the human makeup. I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that the point we stepped away from the teeming mass of the rest of natural life into, thanks to the development of human consciousness, is the point when, and immediately at that point, the rest of the teeming world of natural life becomes significant to us in a different way. It's no longer just the prey or the victim or the other inhabitants of the open savanna landscape. It has meaning, and then you go into meaning expressed in cave paintings, meaning expressed in song, meaning expressed in those amazing bones made out of the wing bones of a griffon vulture turned into flutes, some of the earliest musical instruments I think ever found. There's astonishing cave paintings, some of which I write about, and then all the way down to things like the relatively recent bog bodies and the kind of messing with nature that you get in the way we've tried to mess with or assert and do a deal with time and season and seasonal change and things like that, so that I love all of that complicating mess that we've done. It seems to be a definition of our species, and it's absolutely an indication of the separation of us from the rest of the world. The famous question that Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, asked: "What is it like to be a bat?" Well, we can never say what it is like to be a bat. Whatever Ian Newton might think, actually, we can't say what it is like to be a bat. All we can say is what it is like for us to think what it is like to be a bat, and but in that lies all sorts of possibilities.
Yes, and creative possibility, which is what you're touching on the entire time. Now, before I ask you something else, as far as my Q&A box says, nobody has yet asked a question. So if anyone who's listening wishes to ask a question of Tim, after I finish gruelingly attacking him with my questions and reading him his own words, anyone is welcome to ask him questions, but with none there, I shall continue grilling him. Now, one of the words, Tim, that I wrote down very early on in my reading of your wonderful book was Zoom. Now, I didn't mean it at the time, but it wasn't about Zoom in the format, but I wonder whether you know what I mean by Zoom in this sense, in the ornithological optical sense. Do you know what I'm about to refer to in your own work?
No, well, tell me, but I think I know what the concept you're talking about is.
You exquisitely, I'm gushing, I'm sorry, but I just absolutely love your book. It's called Greenery, people. You need to buy this book, and you can do so through the link, which is wildsounds.com, and by so doing, you will make a 10% donation to Norfolk Wildlife Trust. Thank you. But I love this book, and one of the things you do so well in it is zoom in in fact, my telescope is right beside me here, in the optical sense of moving from a very tiny thing and then suddenly taking us to a massive concept attached to that very tiny thing. So I'm thinking of warblers in an acacia bush in Chad who are about to make the giant leap across the Sahara, and you're describing in intimate detail the moment of observation of this little warbler. And then from that you project to a concept, and it's an extremely powerful conceit. It works beautifully. And I wonder if you recognize that in yourself.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the lovely things about nature observation and what it does to the way we think. I mean, because it's nature observation is to do with a sequence of individual encounters, really, and that's why I also love the role and place of notebooks in my life and field notes in my life. I mean, most of this book is got out of various notebooks, which are simply lists of birds that I've seen on the particular day in a particular place. That seems to be enough for me to store up the whole of that day, and I can re-inflate a day normally by the sequence, reading back through the sequence of species I've seen in the place. I mean, I have written down some of my more, anyway, never mind about that. But my special thoughts as I go along sometimes get to them. But I actually write about this in the Chad section, which is set in the South Sahara and the southern half of the Sahara, and about the impossibility of kind of configuring the epic vastness of the desert, the vastitude of the Sahara. That's what I want to call it. This inhospitable sand mass, epic in its scale, with the fact of those individual warblers that I was seeing, Rappel's warblers, subalpine warblers, reed warblers, sedge warblers, in the acacia bushes, as individuals making that crossing across this extraordinary distance of sand and the most inhospitable conditions. So it again, it's a way of tying yourself into the bigger rhythms and stories of time and season and the working of the world. But it's the way we also experience it, isn't it? We don't really know, I don't really know, even having been in the Sahara Desert, how to write about the Sahara Desert, except at a granular level, if you like, which is there's a lot of grains there. But a willow warbler in the Sahara Desert is effectively a granular version of the Sahara. I mean, some of them don't make it across and become themselves sand, but I feel that it's, I mean, just as we are individuals, one person in one life, so is most of the other bits of the natural world that we're looking at. I mean, although we're all, of course, part of bigger organisms and ecologies and tangled banks of life, but I feel it's important. That's the way I respond to the thing, is the individual. I mean, I can cope with a flock. A flock is fine, but I think I suppose it's bringing the scale as close to our own, the human scale, as I can, and that's really what lies behind that. And I love that. I mean, I love what magnification has done. Actually, the zoom effect. That actually you can get it even closer to the one thing. And I've written elsewhere about that effect, and who was the first poet to have a pair of binoculars and what that did to poetry. And I think actually modern poetry is a highly magnified, modern bird poetry is a much more magnified poetry than 19th century bird poetry, say. It's amazing that John Clare saw so many birds without a pair of binoculars. I think actually Edward Thomas was the first poet, a great bird poet, who had a pair of binoculars, but you don't really detect much evidence of his binoculars in the poetry. I think you really have to wait until our time, until Ted Hughes, really, to feel magnification, zoom of that kind is really having an effect. And that's why I think his crows and his thrushes are so terrifying, because they are actually magnified. So I try not to be quite as you know, opticron 40 times as that. I try to keep it within the 8 times or 10 times.
I feel for the benefit of sponsors, other binoculars than opticron are available. This is quite a long one, but I do feel I need to read back to you some words of your own, because one of the very paragraphs that I picked out about this very concept of zoom, from tiny individual lives to great concepts, whether they be in the natural world or our own lives as part of the natural world. This is quite a long one, so forgive me, everyone listening, and forgive me, Tim, for mangling your words. But for birds, migration is common sense, and their travels are commutes, not tourism. Some birds cross the sand at night because it is cooler and because they have the stars to steer by. Some hide in the slim shade of rocks during the day. Some cross in a single non-stop flight, days and nights long. Some break their journeys and eke out their supplies at oases. Some travel in flocks, some alone. Millions make it and life goes on. Millions die. Their bodies mummify in the dry heat, and they pave parts of the desert. Their soft organs dissolve, but their feathers persist and only slowly abrade and granulate after the bird's death, breaking down into a kind of bird sand that joins all the other sand to build the Sahara. And that is, well, speaks exactly what you were talking about, but also what I mean, that you have this wonderful zoom. It was great talking to Tim Dee. He's got great zoom, that man. He's got excellent zoom. One more that I wanted to read to you just briefly. This one I absolutely love because it so perfectly captures the movement of a swallow. In 1 year, to take flies put up by the feet of an eland, a camel, a brown bear, and a reindeer. And with those 4 mammals, we are in 4 biotopes. With the simplicity of that image, it's absolutely gorgeous. I'm still not seeing questions come in. I'm surprised nobody wishes to answer. Oh no, we do have a question. I'll look at that when Tim is next answering a question of mine. Now, a few personal anecdotes really, Tim, because obviously it is a deeply, deeply personal book, and we'll come further onto that in a moment. Red starts. Mm. Red starts are clearly absolutely key beings in your own existence, and they quiver their tails through the book again and again. Talk to us a little bit about red starts and your relationship with red starts.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I've always loved them. I think I saw my first when I was about 10 or 11. At that point, I was just on the verge of moving from South London with my parents to Bristol with my parents. And began to go birdwatching in what have become to me the most important must-go-to landscape in the British Isles in my birding year, which are the oak combes of North Exmoor around Horner Water and Eastwater, just inland from Porlock, which happens to be very near where Coleridge, the man who coined the word greenery, wrote Kubla Khan, was. The red starts there, and I don't know, Coleridge never mentions red starts, although John Clare's wonderful poem on the red starts. So red starts were obviously common birds, much more common than they are now in Britain. There's amazing description or non-description of them in the Heligoland chapter by this extraordinary man who wrote the Bible to all the birds of Heligoland, where he doesn't really mention red starts except to say that they were like a kind of grass, a substrate to the islands, and they're so big with their flocks in the spring and autumn passages. So I've never seen that many. I've never lived immediately with red starts as my neighbours, but I've looked for them almost everywhere I've been, and I love the fact that they're migrants from Africa, and they live in the Sahel, particularly in the wintertime, in their wintertime, in our wintertime. I'm particularly drawn to the migrants that live in the Sahel for some reason. I think it's that primal human landscape, the kind of semi-open thorn scrub savanna landscape that we are known to respond most deeply to, with a prospect of water, a bit of raised ground, where red starts seem to find a happy place in the winter to go to. And then, I mean, there's more recently, and I don't mind talking about this in a way because the book gets us there in the end, there's something extraordinary about this quivering of the tail that red start does. Red start started, the start of this red start means tail. It's an old English word for tail. And most people will know that the red start has a red tail, but it also, most people will know that it has this involuntary quiver or shake of its tail, which is its slight signature. And yet, bizarrely, is the thing it can't see. It does this wonderful tail shake behind it all the time. And I love that, the sort of modesty implied by that, and the casualness as well, the sense of, I am this, but I don't even know that I am it. But I'm just going to be doing it all the time anyway, shaking my tail like this. And it turns out that to cut a long story short, I've got some shakes of my own. I was diagnosed with Parkinson's a few years ago, which has given me a certain tremor, not very much tremor actually, but it suddenly became incredibly important to me that the red starts quiver and my own little Parkinson's tremor were somehow in the same world. And the one made the other bearable for me. And it's hard really to speak about it. I mean, I try, needless to say, to speak about it in the book, because who wouldn't throw up an opportunity to moan about things like that? but it's sort of beautiful to find that there is for me, a kind of natural shake in the world, that somehow that blurring, that the tail, the way the color slides on the tail, is just so exquisite to see. And it's not unique to redstars. Lots of birds have that shake, and other bits of blurring and furriness. I mean, a bumblebee has it, I think, when you look at it, or a willow catkin has it as well, that in the springtime, that sort of soft, multiply edged edge that it gives to the world. And I find that incredibly lovely, warm, and it's like life is nurtured in those furry bits of life. And then to be given an illness, or to find myself with an illness that will give me a shake, and which will increasingly shake me, made the redstart even more my best friend, because it knew what to do with shakes, and I've got to learn really what I'm going to have to do with my own shaking. But it somehow came together, and although long before I had Parkinson's, or was long before I was diagnosed, I was also banging on about redstars. So they predate my shake, which is a good thing as well. I haven't recruited them just because I need them like a sort of bandage. They were good for me before as well.
But there is more meaning to them now. Before, because your diagnosis is an absolutely pivotal moment in the book, and that's really my last question. We've got a couple that have now come in as well. I just wanted to touch on the fact that we have, in terms of the personal, we have two things in common, and I think they're almost the same thing. One is that woodlark song is unquestionably the finest song in the entire world. And the second is that Kathleen Ferrier makes you cry. Now, I think that the fact that woodlark song is quite obviously, inarguably, the finest song in the world, and that Kathleen Ferrier had this exquisite, gorgeous, inimitable voice. I think they're one and the same thing, really.
Yeah, that's lovely. I mean, although I don't compare them directly, but I mean, they are both. They somehow come from the same place. You're right.
They both sob.
Yeah, and it's well, I described the woodlark as having this sort of happy blues quality to it. I mean, which it does. There's those lovely country blues singers from the Southern American states, Skip James, and others who sing songs which are dressed up. Songs like which one memorably covered by Cream called "I'm So Glad," which is absolutely not about being glad. I mean, it's notionally about being glad, but it's a terribly sad song. And now, of course, a woodlark song isn't really about being glad or about being sad. It's about, the size of its syrinx and the size of its testes, and its desire to manage a plot of ground beneath its flight path, and to bring on lots of females and so on. We know all that, that's fine. Just allow us to park all that for a minute, because you're right, it is the saddest song ever told, and the saddest song, and yet it's exhilarating and uplifting, and if something can be sort of elegiac and positive and for life at the same time, it seems to be a woodlark song. And I think that contralto voice of Kathleen Ferrier, especially singing the Mahler, the Song of the Earth, the end of the Song of the Earth, which is my most heart-stopping, crying, having to pull over to the side of the road and get the tissues out moment. And I often do, because I have it on a cassette in the car, in my cranky old car in England. Yeah, there's something there as well. And what is that? That's a funny sort of broken vulnerability in those voices that both she and the bird share. That's sort of, it's amazingly heartening, because it's done with such knowledge of its own of its shortcomings somehow, or of its inevitable failure. I mean, that's so beautifully done. Yeah, it's so modest and exquisite.
Yeah. I feel the same.
I'm crying now thinking about it, actually.
Well, I'm afraid my last question, and we do now have, we won't in fact have time for any more than the questions that have already come in, so thank you to the people who've already asked questions. My last question, while you're feeling vulnerable about Kathleen Ferrier and woodlarks, the revelation of your diagnosis and another revelation come right at the end of the book. And for me at least, and I wonder whether this was intentional. I'm not saying it was in any way a ruse or a cheap trick. That's not what I mean. But it comes as a denouement, and it changes the meaning of the whole book backwards. To me, there was a moment, the word I wrote was spring, because everything I'd read up to that point suddenly played back again in my head with the revelation of your diagnosis and the other thing that you reveal. And you start at the very beginning with a quotation from George Herbert, and now in age I bud again. And then right at the start, in the way up, if I know how life goes, it is as much as anything because of sandpipers and swallows. Thanks to them, I've heard the roaring of the world too, and I find I know a little of its shakes. Spring means more to me, this is a separate quotation, spring means more to me with every year that passes and takes me deeper into my own autumn. And there are suddenly 1,000 moments in the book, especially around certain writers, Lawrence, for example, that make twice the sense, even though they made sense the first time, in the context of the last chapter. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's the job, isn't it? That's what I'm meant to be doing.
Well, you do it magnificently.
I mean, well, thank you. I mean, of course, I knew where the book was going to end as I was writing it, although actually lots of the things that happen in the book happen long before what happens at the end of the book. But the way I wrote them was it's true. I have seeded the book with things to bloom later on. I rather love that, though. I mean, I don't love it in myself. I feel it's something I do. But I mean, I love the way in which you can discover new things. Things happen to you, and you discover all sorts of the significance of things in your past life that you didn't know about, or things that you've seen and heard and spoken to, people you've met, become change as a result of something that's happened to you much later on. And to be able to unpick that and unroll that. And in fact, that's what, of course, the metaphor here is spring itself, isn't it? I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, is that you know, what begins as a seed will indeed become a fruit, or whatever it is, and it will come round again. And so if you have some denouements to put at the end of your book, you need to make sure that you've got the seeds for them, or the eggs for them in the nest, you know, long before they're going to hatch. And actually, it sounds like I sound like I'm on thought for the day when I say this, but you know, being told you've got this illness in some ways was the best thing that ever happened to me. It gave me a kind of narrative shape instantaneously. Even as I was cycling back from the hospital, I said I knew that's where I had to go with this book. I mean, it makes me sound like a crude exploiter of my own life. I mean, in some ways, that's what writers are, aren't they? But I mean, well, you have to. Nothing is not material. But yeah, I think it's lovely to be given a chance. I feel really grateful to be given a chance to sort of explain myself to myself, and weirdly, to do that with swallows and redstarts is, I didn't know that I could do that, but I think that's what I've tried to do, and it's explained my life to me. I mean, that's it. So I've discovered myself, as well as carefully, you know, seeding and pinning all these things in along the storyline, if you like.
Well,
that's a sweet thing to say.
With great beauty, and there's nothing self-indulgent or wallowing or hammy about it in the slightest. Now, Tim, we're quite tight for time, but I will ask a couple. So I'll read a question first, which comes to us from Danielle Chetwood. Thank you very much, Danny. She's curious, which aspects of your experience do you find yourself most moved by, or most moved to write about first? Is it the visual experience, the auditory experience, or the emotional experience of an event?
That's a good question. Well, I've now got hearing aids in both ears, as well as falling apart elsewhere in my body. So my auditory command is not as good as it used to be. My smell is gone. That's a Parkinson's symptom, as well as a COVID symptom, as it turns out. So I have to banish those things. I guess it's to answer this in a slightly round the houses way. The most important thing for me is having seen the creature or been in the place more than once, actually, to be coming back to an encounter, or to be repeating a meeting with a bird or an animal or a landscape, that's where the thing begins to work and to come into language for me. I think, a lot of my lovely friends go out on a walk and write a book, or have a project and make a book out of it, and they can be wonderful books. For me, almost everything that's in this book existed for me before it was ever going to be in a book. Nothing in there was made for the book, if you see what I mean. And so therefore, I suppose it's emotional to answer the question. I mean, it's my emotional relationship with something that is an accumulated emotional relationship over years in some cases. I mean, of course, I've only been to Chad once, but at least I was looking at birds in Chad, or trying to look at birds in Chad that I'd seen somewhere else, things like that. So I mean, I'm not a purist about this, but I think that's important to me, is to have a kind of history with life, not only my own life, but with wildlife, and to be able to go back to it, and to be able to have been with it in the first place without thinking, how am I going to write this in a book?
Thank you on Danielle's behalf. Now, David, are we able to bring in John Pilgrim, who is going to ask his own question, I hope? Do we have, we do. John, are you with us? So I've still got a blocked microphone.
Yes, I'm here.
John, do you want to ask your question of Tim?
Yes, Tim, in the book you mention how women in Central Europe used to do dances that mimic swallows. Are you aware of other examples of people using dance to celebrate birds? And
that's a good question. I think isn't there a fantastic depiction at in Çatalhöyük in Turkey of a crane dance on a wall painting. So very, very ancient. That was one of the first agricultural settlements, I think, if I understand it right. I've been there with Mark Cocker, as it turns out, looking for rooks. Yeah, so I think of course there's all there must be other bird dances, mimics, and there's Native American crow dances, raven dances, eagle dancing as well, isn't there? But I mean, so there's all sorts of stuff there. I was particularly struck by that swallow dance because it was modern. I mean, it was 19th century and yet still somehow connected to something anciently observed.
So we have a couple more questions about music, and in fact, John asked a second half of the question that's written here about how music helps us relate to birds and celebrate birds. But Rick Wright asks a question, asks you to talk about whether bird song is itself music, or whether our use of words like music, note, phrase, etc. is simply metaphorical in description of bird song.
Yeah, that's again a good question. I did try to write about this once, not in this book, but for an article in the Times Literary Supplement. But I'm trying to remember what I said. I mean, we can get bogged down in the debate about whether bird song is music, and there are all the famous attempts to transcribe it. I mean, Messiaen and others putting bird song into musical form and notation. I'm not bothered whether we consider it music or not. I mean, I love the fact that it is both. It exists for us as a musical idiom, and it exists for birds as I've said earlier. It's entirely to do with natural selection has driven the production of song in order to secure the future of the genetic content of the male. And so on. I mean, so I'm not worried about the terms really. There's a record I used to listen to a lot, by a Hungarian composer who slowed down bird song and made people sing it. And it's incredibly beautiful to hear it brought within the human vocal range. The woodlark song, in fact, there's an amazingly exquisite Hungarian baritone singer singing a woodlark song slowed down about 30 times. And when you slow down the bird song, you see the sorts of patterns in it. And I also remember the wonderful artist called Marcus Coates, who did the same thing, recorded a spring torn chorus in Britain and then slowed it down and played it back through the headphones of various people who got them to sing it back, and it sounds amazing, and then speeded up the film of them singing, and they became pheasants and willow tits and marsh warblers and all sorts of things. So yeah, I haven't answered the question because I'm not a musician. I love the fact that we can talk about it as music, and that it isn't music as far as the birds are concerned. That's a good rich seam of awkwardness to work with.
And creativity so often is related to that awkwardness, that questioning. In fact, partly to answer Rick's question, I'm going to read Tim to Tim from April. You've been listening to a song thrush in the wood through the wintertime, and in April, the wood thickened with other songs and insects and leaves. One night, a male nightingale that knew the wood's shadow below it, for it had hatched there too, came down from the sky and began its own singing to mark its place and to coax any female that was following in the dark. In the time the thrush had kept to these trees, the nightingale had been beyond the middle of the world at the equator. In the first creep of daylight, as the nightingale sang on, it heard itself being sung by the song thrush, because your thrush had learned to sing the song of the nightingale the year before. That's extremely opposite to that question of how they see themselves. Now, one last question comes from Dr. Tony Sinnott. In a world where mindfulness might be useful to reduce stress, do you have any practical tips for improving our appreciation of the natural world?
Well, to go out into it is the first thing. I mean, just spend time in it. I think learning about what you're listening to and what you're looking at is enlarging and enriching. Sometimes we feel awkward about that, about the kind of classification and the accumulation of knowledge that implies, the sort of mapping out and staking out of the frogs in a marsh or the birds above Cley Marsh, say. That's never been a problem for me. Knowing has never got in the way of feeling. I mean, that might be something that people debate. I mean, how much you need to know and how much, if you do know, you can't feel, and vice versa. I mean, getting rid of one's own baggage is quite a good thing that nature can help you with. Looking at life that doesn't need bags even. I mean, I write about bags in this book. I love the fact that's the thing I first say when people say, why do you like birds so much? I say because they don't carry bags. So, isn't it amazing that a swallow can live with me here in Cape Town for half the year and live with Nick in North Norfolk for half the year, and it hasn't got a bloody carrier bag or one of those bags with little wheels on it that you wheel behind yourself at Stansted Airport. I mean, isn't that fantastic? So mindfulness, aka baglessness, would be my message. You know, get rid of the baggage, and one way to get rid of your baggage is to study those, to spend time with those who don't have bags.
You remind me, Tim, of Gerald Durrell, who asked why he liked animals so much, gave a whole list of perfectly biological things, and then at the end he said, and above all, they don't hold drinks parties. It is a very fine reason for loving animals. Now, Tim, before we finish, I'm slightly trespassing on time, but I wanted to ask about this, because I know it's of great importance to you. The cover of your book is a thing of great beauty. Please just give us a word about what it means to you and where it comes from.
Yeah, well, it's a painting or a picture by a great friend of mine who's now dead, sadly, called Greg Poole, who I think was the finest wildlife artist, if that's the term we use necessarily, of his generation. He died just as my book was coming to an end. He didn't even know that the cover of the book was going to be the cover of the book. That's thanks to his widow and his estate. He was from Bristol and a wonderful birdwatcher. and a true naturalist, much more of a naturalist than I ever have been able to becoming increasingly fascinated and obsessed with insects in his later years. Great painter of insects, an amazing painter of butterflies, student of David Measures, a wonderful artist, not known enough, not treasured enough, also now dead, sadly. A wonderful painter of butterflies, David Measures. But Greg was unique, had his own a crazy saxophonist, I mean, a very good person to talk music and birds with, that had a heart attack and never regained consciousness, sadly, and died in the winter of 2018. He also worked with me on the book I wrote before this book, which is a book about gulls on rubbish dumps called Landfill. He drew marvelously by sitting in the boot of his car on the top of a multi-story car park in Bristol. He drew the gulls nesting on the rooftops of Bristol city centre, where they've converted skyscrapers and office blocks into a kind of marine archipelago. And he crouched in his car and did these fantastic life studies of these herring gulls and lesser blackback gulls, eking out the living between the cooling vents and the wire mesh of the rooftops. He was amazingly funny. He had a beautiful Bristol accent. He was into the mindfulness, actually. He taught me meditation. We used to get copies of the Handbook of the Birds of the World, which people might know is a big chunky volume. And 2 volumes of the Handbook of the Birds of the World made a perfect cushion for not too comfortable to sit on, but just enough levitation to do your meditation. So I miss him, and he's a great guy. His ashes is actually scattered in a place where I now, unfortunately, also have the job to scatter my father's ashes as well, who died early this year. A beautiful hill between Bristol and Bath called Kelston Clump, a beach-topped hill, visible from Greg's house in Redland in Bristol, and visible also from my father's homes in Bristol over his years, and my father's father, who worked in a chocolate factory at Fry's in Keynsham between Bristol and Bath, and used to think of the trees as his own as well. So sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but Greg was he was also a challenger of my pretension, but he had his own pretensions as well. So we used to meet and joust with our pretensions.
Well, it is doubly touching that the cover means so very much to you, and it is a fitting cover for the book. Tim, we must sadly leave it there. So on all of the audience's behalf, and on my behalf and Norfolk Wildlife Trust's behalf, we'd like to thank you very much. But before finishing, and I will round up with a quick note just at the end after we've thanked you, but to reveal a second denouement at the end of the book, I believe tomorrow is a very significant day in the Dee family, is it not?
It is. It's my youngest son, Adam's first birthday tomorrow. So he's not here, unfortunately. He's staying with his grandparents tonight, so I can talk to you without him screaming and crawling all over my face. But yeah, so a year ago, I was in a hospital in Cape Town. In fact, I'd arrived in Cape Town not long before in order to be with my wife when she had our baby, when I expected to be able to whisk her away to England to come and do the Greenery thing with me in England this spring. That wasn't to be, but one of the great good things about being locked down and held in captive in here has been having a whole year of almost daily continuous baby, which is a wonderful horizon fixer and time manager, as everyone knows. So it's my older children are now in their late 20s with a different mother, I should say. So I've been given a third chance, another go at doing it, or getting it right or getting it wrong. And of course, they're much better than you are, and they are your own spring. So that's if you're looking for a bit of spring manufacturing, that's what you got to do.
Well, a very happy birthday from us all. A very happy first birthday to young Adam. And thanks to him and thanks to Claire for letting you join us this evening. And thank you very much indeed for your company, Tim. It's been an absolute joy. May I just finish off by saying that there is a link beside your screen to both Norfolk Wildlife Trust, where should you be so moved, you can make a donation, which will help us greatly in this year where many of our income streams have been starved. And of course, there is also a link to wildsounds.com, where you can buy Tim's wonderful book, Greenery. If you haven't read it, I cannot encourage you enough to do so. It is a joy to read, and I was genuinely saddened to finish reading it, and shall be soon reading it again. So thank you all very much indeed for paying attention, for listening in, and we look forward to seeing you at another Norfolk Wildlife Trust online event very soon. Goodbye.